again, everybody, and welcome to Tiger Sidelines on MC22. My name is Bo Bayman. Glad to be joined, as always, by Gabe DeArmond and Dave Matter, and happy to have you on our Zoom little cocktail party, if you will, although we should be drinking more if that's the case. But nevertheless, there was much celebration last week. We talked about it on our show last week. But as Mizzou Wrestling moves back to the Big 12, I know you guys were there for the announcement, and there was a lot of fanfare, a lot of the muckety mucks, if you will, within the athletic department were there. This turned out, in my eyes, to be a bigger deal to the university than even I thought, with them moving back to the Big 12, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been Missouri's best program over, I don't know, I mean, more than a decade now. And it doesn't maybe get the attention of a really good Missouri football team like we've seen that's won double-digit games, but they are consistently the best program competing on a national stage. But when you're in the Mid-American Conference, during the regular season and then the beginning of the postseason, you're not on a very big stage nationally. And this puts them back in that spotlight. I think it'll be good for fans that maybe care a little bit more about, who the opponent is, or just the prestige of having home meets that are conference meets against old Big 12 teams, even though there's only 3 of them, 4 if you count West Virginia. But it just seems like this is something that program kind of needed. I mean, the best team on campus kind of got the shaft when they went to the SEC. So this was a good day for them.
And it does renew those rivalries with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and Iowa State. And I think fans are going to be excited for that game.
Well, not that Ryder and Longmont or Longwood or, Central Michigan don't get the blood boiling. But, this is teams people recognize, and it's the second best wrestling conference in the country. And like Dave said, it's the most successful team Missouri has. So good news. I did have to chuckle a little bit at the reaction of, well, I hope this doesn't mean any other sports are going back to the Big 12. No, because the other sports actually have a conference to play in, and it's a good conference. Wrestling did not.
That is certainly one thing where fans get a little confused. Somebody like wrestling who's out there almost as an independent, really, and then everybody thinks, so we're all going back to the Big 12? No, that's not the case. But
well, because conferences as a whole concept are just kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, when I had to look up who was in the Big 12 in wrestling to write a story, and I'm like, well, that's not the Big 12. Like, it might share the same name, but that's just kind of a group of schools that wrestles together.
And if you look it up, it's unbelievable who's in the Big 12, because you're like, this is, like you said, it's not the Big 12, but it does carry the weight of the Big 12, and that is ultimately what they needed because they dominated the MAC so much.
Yeah, and you wonder too, like, did that impact them once they got to the national tournament? Were they really tested enough? Now, Brian Smith, he kept saying nothing's going to change. They're going to recruit the same caliber of wrestlers. They're going to try to win a national championship. That's still the goal. But will they be more tested? Will there be less of a transition going from the Big 12 to the national stage than there was from the MAC to the national stage? And if so, then that's why this is a real plus.
Well, and it's a perfect example of, you just spin it toward whatever you have, right? Brian Smith says, oh, no, the MAC wasn't a problem. Meanwhile, Eli Drinkwitz is out here telling kids, you want to play in the best league in the country, come play here, right? So you sell whatever you've got.
Yes, excellent point. Let's talk about the SEC now. And let's start with softball, where the number 15 softball team won 2 of 3 against number 6 Arkansas, winning the first 2 6-3 and 10-1. They lost the finale 8-4, but they're now 34-11, 12-6 in the SEC, and tied for 3rd in the league. And this team is really on the cusp and maybe teetering on hosting a regional, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you go to Arkansas, first place team in the league, and the question about this Missouri team was, well, do they have the pitching? Well, they threw 2 hitters in each of the first 2 wins, or the first 2 games, both wins. So the pitching held up for sure. They couldn't finish off the sweep, but to get that series win, they're still in position to finish really high in the conference. And they're not eliminated from winning the conference. And I don't think that should be, it's not a disappointment if they don't. But if this team finishes 2nd or 3rd, that's a big statement. And, you carry that over to the national tournament. Then if you get a chance to host, I know they want to. Then really exciting times. I think no one expected this except maybe Larissa Anderson to happen as quickly as it has.
They had some shining moments last year in the COVID shortened year, Gabe, and it kind of gave you little glimpses of what this team could be. But to Dave's point, I'm not even sure that anybody except for the people in that locker room thought they could be this good.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, already through 45 games to have 34 wins is impressive. And when you play in the SEC, to me, it makes it even like a little bit more impressive.
Well, and the way they're doing it, I mean, it's funny. I talked to Jim Sturk last week, and he said, Larissa has a pitching background. And when we went to interview her, I really liked her, but then she had a pitcher throw a no-hitter in the NCAA tournament, and that sold me, and I knew she would get it done. And I said, well, the irony here is they're getting it done by scoring like 92 runs a game, right? They hit 320-foot home runs, and they just outscore people. And the pitching is they're kind of, like Dave said last week, they're kind of piecemealing it. So you look at where they're at and you're happy, but Larissa Anderson has to be sitting there going, and this is super high level analysis, if I can find my Chelsea Thomas or something, right, that I can throw out there 3 days every weekend, then this thing could really get fun. I mean, this could, you're talking about a team that's trying to catch like the Oklahomas and that level of program. And so that's what they're missing, I think.
And if they can get that, and now it might be a little easier to get that just because if you look at the team, you're going to get run support. You know that they're going to hit. So if you're a top pitcher, you're like, boy, I could really maybe put that team over the edge. And that's what Larissa can sell.
Yeah. And that's where the payoff could really come is, you can start getting back to kind of where Aaron Earlywine was, where all of a sudden, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. He can go out and recruit some of the best players in the country. And she clearly knows what she's doing. She's already has a really good team. And all that's going to do is help her with recruiting. She told me a couple of weeks ago that she takes it real personal when a player that they want from the state of Missouri goes somewhere else. So we've heard coaches at every sport at Mizzou say they want to seal the borders, but what she's doing right now, I give her a really good chance of being a coach that can actually do that.
Yeah, no doubt. Up next, Missouri hosts number 3 Florida. It's a huge 3-game series in Columbia this weekend, and it'll air on the SEC Network Plus. Boy, if they could somehow get 2 out of this one, Gabe, then all of a sudden you're talking about almost, I don't want to use the word lock, but almost a lock to host a regional if they can get 2 out of 3.
I would think so. I mean, even if they don't, I think they're in really good shape. It would be, they're ranked in the top 15 and, 16 teams are going to host. So I think they'll have an excellent shot. And look, that new stadium and things like that don't hurt when you're getting into these discussions. It's not as simple as the NCAA basketball tournament where it's largely just kind of merit. It's, hey, we have these other things that might work in our favor too. So yeah, I think that's a big deal, but I think at this point, that's kind of a given. They've now got their eyes set on, hey, if we can win all these, we're going to be leading the SEC or right there at least. And we've got the tiebreaker over Arkansas now. So this is a team that, and Missouri fans should not take this for granted. It doesn't happen much, right? They've got a legitimate shot to win an SEC championship.
And that was going to be my next point is I think Missouri fans, Dave, need to wake up to this team to realize they've sort of flown under the radar this spring, and they need to realize that this could be a really big story late spring into the early summer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think the fact that last year they got cut off, they played one series. So actually, did they really win the SEC last year? Because they were 3-0. So they could maybe put a banner up for that. And then the year before, was her first year. And then all in between that, they had the NCAA postseason ban kind of hanging over them. So it's understandable if the bandwagon got a little bit light, and there were still some pro Earlywine fans out there, I'm sure, that were kind of skeptical of this hire and weren't sure what to think of it. But it's a shame that they have the COVID, capacity limitations at the stadium, because that place would be full this weekend for that Florida series. So the hope is that they can get back to being full next year and still be a really good team, which I would think they would be.
Well, there was good news and bad news and bad news and bad news and bad news for the baseball team. The good news was they finally won a game, breaking a 6-game losing streak by beating Georgia 6-4 on Friday. But then they lose the final two to Georgia. They lose an extra inning game, and then they lose 9-4. And then they go to K-State and they give up 5 in the first and end up losing 13-8. The team now 12-26, 5-13 in the SEC. And I mean, we just talk about it week after week. When they score 8 runs, they can't pitch. When they score 4 runs, they can't hit. I mean, they just don't do anything well. And that is a huge problem when you're in the SEC.
Yeah, look, we can talk about this the same way every single week. They're not very good, right? I mean, they might finish 12th in the SEC and get into the tournament, and if so, okay. And they might finish 13th and not get in, and that's really where they're at.
And if they do finish 12th and get in, there will be zero expectation for them, because at that point you're playing that one game to get into the double elimination. But this team doesn't have an ace. They don't have somebody they can throw out there and say, hey, I know it's going to be maybe 104 pitches, but we need you. They talk about piecemeal. They have to piecemeal together. And when they piecemeal, it's kind of like, can we hold them to 5 or 6?
Yeah, I mean, Seth Halverson has shown moments of being that ace. He kind of moved into that Friday role. He's had some good games, but they just don't have it. It's just a lost season. I think this is already the most losses they've had under Steve Beazer, who, in those first 2 years, they were right there, on the fringe of getting into a regional, just were a couple wins short. And now, obviously, much more than a few wins short. I mean, they got off to that terrible start in non-conference play and just never caught any kind of momentum. They're just not good enough.
And we can talk about this all the time too. Is Steve Beazer going to be on the hot seat? It will depend on how much they care about baseball.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Dave might know his contract status. I don't, but he's not going to get fired. I mean, I asked Stirk last week. I just asked him flat out. I said, what are the hurdles for you to compete in this league? And he went on and on about money and facilities and stuff. And, that's fine. But the reality is Missouri's never going to be on the level of some of these other teams in those categories. So you better find a different way, because money doesn't change geography. It doesn't change interest in the sport from really mid-Missouri, because you're not expecting people to come from Kansas City or St. Louis to go to these games. I mean, they need to fill that stadium based on people from around the area. And it would be fine to say they just do that by winning, but that's been proven in the past not to be true. So, yeah, it'd be great if Max Scherzer decided to cut a $10 million check and build a new stadium and all that, but that's not going to fix everything that stands between Missouri and being good in this league.
Yeah, no doubt. The Tigers will travel to Alabama for 3 games on the weekend. They host Southeast Missouri for a midweek game next Tuesday. Okay, let's take our first break. When we come back, we'll check the Twitter feed. You're watching Tiger Sidelines on MC22. Welcome back, everybody. My name is Bo Bayman. Glad you could join us here on Tiger Sidelines. Dave Matter, Gabe DeArmond joined me as well. And we're at Tiger Sidelines, as we tell you every single week, on Twitter. And we got some tweets this week. Our first one is from Big E, who gives a pretty good compliment to Dave Matter. Hello, fellas. I like Dave's breakdown of the SEC West this fall. I haven't read his East yet. Which of the West teams do you feel like might surprise us, and why? And then throw in your East teams as well, and I'll read his East later this week.
Okay. He's talking football here, and out of the West, the team that's weirdly getting a lot of hype, and the ESPN Football Power Index, they do those simulations, computer simulations, like 20,000 of them of the season. Mississippi State really scored high in those. They bring back a pretty good defense. Mike Leach has some quarterback options now. I don't know if they're going to be very good. They looked pretty good the last game of the year. That's because Missouri was pretty terrible. But I think they would probably be the surprise. I mean, nobody's going to be surprised if Alabama's really good again. And maybe LSU bounces back some. Ole Miss is a team that I think has got a lot of firepower. Now they're an adventure every week because they don't play a lot of defense, and they didn't last year. But They're one of the few teams that have a really established quarterback coming back. So I think they are. I'd put more stock in Ole Miss than Mississippi State.
Is there a team over there? Maybe it's Arkansas. Is there a team that takes a step back?
Well, it's not. I don't think it's Alabama. Auburn has a coaching change. Maybe A&M. I still think they're pretty set up to be pretty good. I don't know. I don't think there's one team that's really going to take a big. A&M would be the natural answer just because they only lost one game last year.
Ohio State wide receiver Jamison Williams in the transfer portal, and Ben wants to know, what have you heard? Because boy, he'd be interesting on the Mizzou sideline.
Yeah, and he's good friends with Mookie Cooper. And, I talked to Jamison when he was a junior in high school at a camp at Missouri. He never really considered Missouri. I mean, it was always pretty obvious he was going somewhere else out of high school. But I've heard Missouri, Texas, and Alabama as the schools mentioned. I know that Georgia has reached out to him. He's going to have a lot of options. From what I've heard, basically, this whole COVID year messed a lot of things up. And what it did was have Ohio State bring back a lot of guys that maybe people didn't think were going to leave. And so Williams is kind of looking at this and going, well, how does my playing time increase when all these guys came back? Now, if I'm a college football player going, I didn't play as much as I wanted here and I want to play more, I'm not sure Alabama is the place I end up, but, also an Alabama offer, if he has one, is pretty tough for a lot of kids to turn down. So I think if I had to put money on it, in the end, it'll be Alabama or Missouri.
And wasn't there news this week about a Missouri cornerback who he decides to enter the portal, it's an odd time to enter the portal, but he's going to put his name out there.
He just showed up too. Jadarius Perkins hasn't played a game yet. Junior college transfer who enrolled, I think, was it after signing day or
no,
right around there, a little bit after the semester started though. It wasn't
yeah, like he enrolled in January, but then they didn't tell anybody he was here for like 2.5 weeks. Nobody knew he signed.
And he was playing with the Wands in spring camp. So it's not like, he was down with the walk-ons or anything like that.
Our next one comes to us from Casey High School Baseball, who said, Gabe, I really liked your Kim English chat last night. Do you think he will regularly tell his team to put a little English on it? I'll show myself out, he says. But nevertheless, that was a good chat with the former Tiger.
Yeah, I assumed that tweet was kind of a little veiled shot, maybe at the Mizzou Arena PA announcer. I could be wrong, but that's the way I took it because I remember, English class and some of the puns that would occur. But yeah, we talked to Kimmy for about 30-40 minutes last night, and it was interesting. He said he's got a binder that he started when he was a player at Missouri about, hey, this is what I'm going to do when I'm a head coach, and he goes back and rereads it and updates it every year. And I think he'll do well. I mean, George Mason in the A-10 is not the easiest job, but there is some history there. He's from the area. There's a lot of talent, and he's been on this path for a while. But it was interesting, and Dave, you'll remember this too. I think when we were talking last night, I realized that when George Mason made the Final Four in 2006, I actually watched that game in Mizzou Arena right before Mike Anderson was introduced as Missouri's head coach. So that was kind of a connection there.
That is interesting. I'll tell you, the one thing that I took from this is just totally the way Kimmy was he talks about character. He talks about building the program. And I found it interesting that he said he may not have to get on an airplane to recruit because where he is so fertile over there.
Yeah, I mean, now Kim loves him some Baltimore basketball. There's no question about that. But there are a lot of players out of Baltimore, the DC area. I mean, you're talking, Carmelo Anthony's come out of there, Kevin Durant. There's a lot of dudes around now. Probably that level of player isn't realistic to go to George Mason, but I know a lot of Missouri fans will be watching, and I know the natural follow-up question, let's just let the kid coach some games and see how he does.
Yep. Steve wants to know, given everything what is the ceiling for Mizzou football this fall? What would be the best road trip to see the Tigers on the road this season?
I'm looking forward to Boston College because I've never been to Boston before. Otherwise, you can't go wrong with Athens. I think it's the best college town in the SEC. I mean, I'm leaving Columbia out because I live here, but It's a great trip. I tell everybody they should make it at least once. As far as their ceiling, I mean, they're not going to be favored in that game in Athens, and Florida comes to Columbia. They're the two best teams on the schedule. Although maybe Texas A&M is. A&M comes here, I believe. Is 9-3? Is that doable? Sure, but I think people forget, as excited as they were about last season, Missouri was a lot closer to 2-8 last year than 8-2. I mean, they had some really narrow wins. They didn't have narrow losses. They were generally blown out, whether that was Florida or Georgia or Mississippi State. Alabama was kind of a weird game first of the year, but and then they got by against LSU and Kentucky and South Carolina. So I still think they can be pretty good, but they're going to have some toss-up games. There's no doubt about that.
I think this is the time of year where fans always look at their own team and assume the best, and look at everybody else and assume the worst. And they go, well, we were better than them last year, so that's an automatic win. And we weren't as good as them last year, but we're better, so we've got a shot there. And that's just not how it works. I go into this season kind of saying the baseline is 7-5. 7-5 is where nobody should complain. You should be, and I don't really, get me wrong, at 5-7, I'm not sure people should complain in year two, but 7-5, I think, would be reasonable. People define ceiling and floor, because people ask me that every year. And I say, well, I would say the ceiling this year is 10-2, because they'll probably lose Georgia in at least one other game. But if everything else goes perfectly, they could go 10-2, but the floor's 4-8. I mean, the floor's beaten Vanderbilt and the three rummies in the non-conference, and that's about it. Because if you're talking best case, worst case, that's probably worst case.
And I don't think anybody would be surprised with a little regression. I mean, everybody, to me, when you think of last year, you think of, holy cow, we beat LSU. Holy cow, we went 5-5. But they stumbled a little bit down the stretch, and if they regress to another 5-7 year, okay, well, maybe that's progress. To me, it all depends on who you beat.
This is also kind of year one, though. They played one of those games with 51 dudes. I mean, last year just kind of doesn't really count to me.
Yep, I totally agree with that. Okay, thanks for all those tweets. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the NFL draft. You're watching Tiger Sidelines right here on MC22. Welcome back, everybody. This is Tiger Sidelines on MC22. Gabe DeArmond, Dave Matter, and I'm Bo Bayman. Thanks, as always, for joining us. And Dave, one thing before we get into the NFL draft, something that happened beforehand affects a former Missouri Tiger, and that's Drew Lock. And I know that you had a pretty good story on his latest challenge in Denver as the Broncos make a change and bring in Teddy Bridgewater. Maybe not the worst case scenario for Drew, but nevertheless, it is going to be a challenge come summer camp.
Yeah, not exactly a sign of faith that they believe in Drew to be the franchise quarterback. And frankly, we're taping this on Thursday. They have the number 9 pick in the draft Thursday night. There's people who cover the Broncos on a daily basis still think that they're in the hunt for one of those quarterbacks. And whether that's Bridgewater and Justin Fields or Trey Lance next year, Drew Lock might end up being traded somewhere else. And maybe that's for the best. It seems like it's one step forward, 2 step backs with him in Denver. He's done some good things. He had that great comeback win against the Chargers last year that actually cost Denver like 4 spots in the draft. If they lost that game, they're picking 4th tonight. And, then they could, who knows, they'd have a shot at all the quarterbacks except for Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson. But I don't know about his future. You see good things, but also it's just like there's no patience for young quarterbacks anymore in the NFL. You don't get 3 years anymore. You get maybe 1.5.
Didn't you kind of take it the other? I think that was actually everybody knew they were bringing in a quarterback. That's a lot better than them going and picking a guy at number 9, which you said, maybe they still do. And look, as a Chiefs fan, I hope they do. Please, God, yes, let that team draft a quarterback in the first round because they need so many other things besides that. Please let them do it. But I'd rather be competing against Teddy Bridgewater than watch my team pick a guy number 9 and give him $80 million. And basically that's them telling me, look, you're just holding your place till this guy's ready.
Yeah, I just don't think they love him there.
Yeah.
It just seems like they're just looking for reasons to play somebody else.
Well, he's given him a few.
Yeah. As Dave mentioned, we're taping this on Thursday before the first round. The highest guy to go is going to be Nick Bolton. It seems like his name was originally maybe in the late first round, but it seems to me now, as I read things, he's probably more a day 2 selection, right?
Yeah, I don't think he's necessarily done anything. For one, teams play only 2 linebackers on the field most of the time anyway. So, and you look at like what the teams need in this draft, not many of them have an immediate need at linebacker. So, and there's some pretty good ones out there that are just maybe a hair better than him in certain areas. That one thing I've heard the most about Nick is that he's not tall enough. Well, that's crazy. I mean, he's 5'11". I mean, if 1 inch is going to make that big of a difference, so be it. But I still think he'll end up somewhere middle of the second round, have a chance to start and play a lot this year. And we saw he's a great player. He makes plays no matter if he's 5'10" or 6'2", whatever it is.
Yeah. Gabe, who else can we look for in the 3 days for Missouri to be drafted?
I think it's pretty safe to say that Tyree Gillespie and Larry Borum are going to get picked at some point. Now, I'm not sure either of them is picked until day 3. They could be, but I think I would set the over-under at 3.5 because I'm pretty sure those 3 guys are going to get drafted. And Larry Roundtree could, Josh Bledsoe could. But I feel like every year we go into the draft saying X number of guys could be drafted. And what it ends up being is about X minus 3 because we just don't. I follow college football for a living. And out of the 250 players that are drafted, I promise I'm never going to have heard of 100 of them. Like never even heard their names. And we just don't realize all the other guys that are out there.
It's the old adage: if you can play, they will find you, and so that's why you get these guys from Wisconsin Whitewater and places like that. That's their job. They're supposed to find you guys. It doesn't have to be Power 5 guys all the time.
And they still miss 50% of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll see which Tigers get selected, and we'll talk about that next week. Want to thank you for watching. Want to thank all our people behind the scenes. For Matt and Brian behind the scenes, that's Dave Matter and Gabe DeArmond. I'm Bo Bayman. Thanks as always for watching Tiger Sidelines. We'll see you next week, everybody, right here on MC22.